50 years ago, in March of 1970, a monumental document came into force with ratification from 43 states, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Fast forward to 2019, we are on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution fueled by artificial intelligence. In Stanford professor Andrew Ng's words, AI is the new electricity. However, just like electricity, AI is a double-edged sword. Advanced AI systems can be used to enhance education, improve the efficiency of transportation, fight epidemics, support the elderly, and support better governance. However, AI-based technologies can also deepen existing inequalities, create new inequalities, and exacerbate geopolitical tensions. How might we, policymakers, academics, and private individuals come together and establish appropriate governance structures and support mechanisms for artificial intelligence? That is the motivation of today's breakout session. My name is Stone Yang. I'm a second-year undergraduate student studying computer science and philosophy here at Stanford. My student organization, Computer Science+Social Good, has been leading the conversation on campus around maximizing the social good led by technology and mitigating its harms. We are extremely honored to host the AI Global Governance breakout session today, and we sincerely thank all of you, speakers and audience, for coming to today's session. In our session, we will hear from 4 distinguished speakers coming from a range of different backgrounds and interests. They are Professor Eileen Donahoe, Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University; Mrs. Jessica Newman, AI Policy Specialist with the Future of Life Institute, Research Fellow at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and Research Advisor to the Future Society; Mr. Peter Xion, Research Affiliate at the Center for the Governance of AI at the Future of Life Institute at the University of Oxford; and Mr. Phil Beaudoin, Senior Vice President of the Research Group and co-founder of Element AI. After their individual presentations, we will have a panel discussion followed by an audience Q&A session. Now, without further ado, let's give our warmest applause to Professor Eileen Donahoe, who is going to present on human rights as the foundation for global governance of AI. Welcome.
Thank you, Stone. So the basic purpose of my talk today is to show how the existing international human rights framework can serve as the foundation for global governance of AI. And in my time, I want to try to do 3 things. First, I want to step back and ask the question, what do we mean by AI global governance? Second, I'll try to answer the question, why turn to human rights for that purpose? And third, I'm going to talk about a few emerging mechanisms for global human rights-based governance of AI. So what do we mean by AI global governance? Just as AI can mean many things to many people, governance also can have many meanings. Governance can refer to formal government regulation, institutions and structures. It can refer to internal accountability mechanisms for the private sector or NGOs. And governance can also just point to the underlying normative principles and commitments that guide a governing entity. This is a very quick, stripped-down snapshot of a variety of AI governance activities that are happening to date. On the government front, what we see is that a number of governments, I've heard something like 25 governments have put out national AI strategies, primarily focused on R&D investment in AI. At the local level, we've seen a smattering of regulations focused on government use of AI, such as bans on facial recognition in law enforcement. We've seen that in San Francisco, Oakland, and a couple other cities. At the regional level, I'd say the best example comes from the EU, where GDPR, Article 22, speaks to the right of data subjects not to be subject to decisions based solely on automated processing, if those decisions might have significant effect on legal rights. And then at the intergovernmental international level, at the UN, there has been over the last 3 years a global summit on AI for good, which is focused primarily on the application of AI to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But there is not really any expectation anytime soon that there will be an international agreement on AI global governance. In the middle category, the multi-stakeholder realm, various groups from the tech community, civil society, governments have crafted a wide range of normative principles for ethical AI. Examples include the Asilomar principles, the IEEE principles for ethically aligned design for autonomous and intelligent systems, and the EU guidelines for trustworthy AI. And then in addition, we've seen some leadership from a variety of private sector companies, tech companies, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, just to name a few, that are choosing to bind themselves to internally drafted AI principles. And all of this arguably counts as governance of AI, broadly speaking. So bottom line, so far, most of the energy is going into development of new ethical principles for AI. I think a recent number I have heard is something like 260 newly crafted sets of AI principles. And we don't see much action on formal government regulation yet, and not much activity in the international realm on a global framework. So to my core point, why turn to human rights? I believe the existing international human rights framework can provide both the normative and the legal foundation for global governance of AI. Very briefly, for anyone unfamiliar with the International Human Rights Framework, at its core, it includes the original Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, which is a rich normative expression of the rights that adhere in the human person, and two foundational treaties, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, which are legally binding on states and spell out the substantive and procedural rights of individuals and the obligations of states to protect those rights under international law. And then in addition, I'll mention a third piece of the human rights framework of relevance here, which is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, adopted by consensus in 2011 at the UN Human Rights Council. And those principles define the responsibilities of the private sector to respect human rights. My core point is that this human rights framework can do a lot of work for us. Unlike the newly drawn ethical principles, which actors can choose to embrace, the human rights framework is already universally applicable and legally binding. And I believe we ignore this foundation at our own peril. So why is that? What's the risk? Here is what I think is at stake, both normatively and geopolitically. We all know we are in the midst of a global battle for dominance in AI technology, but we also need to recognize that we're in the midst of a geopolitical battle over the values and norms that will inform regulation of AI and guide governance of digitized AI-driven societies more generally. The big picture normative and geopolitical debate from my vantage point is about whether AI will be used to enhance human dignity and reinforce the liberty, equality, and security of people, as envisioned in the human rights framework, or whether AI will be used to undermine human dignity and autonomy, to restrict human freedom, and to move the entire digital world consciously or unconsciously toward digital authoritarianism. I think a global drift toward digital authoritarianism would represent a complete retreat from the human rights vision and also betray the original optimistic vision about the potential of tech and AI to make the world a better place. Further, I'm just going to say at a pragmatic level, if we are actually looking for a global governance framework, I don't think it's realistic to think that at this particular geopolitical moment we have a prayer of getting global agreement on a new comprehensive governance framework that provides anywhere near as rich a basis for assessing the human impact of AI as does the existing framework. And I will note the human rights framework was forged in the aftermath of World War II, which was a rare moment of global consensus about the need for a new normative global compact. And that context is very important. So rather than start from scratch and try to develop a whole new set of normative principles, a whole new legal framework, and then try to get global agreement on it, I believe we should work with the existing framework, acknowledge where it needs to be adapted, and do the hard work of figuring out how to apply it in our radically transformed digital societies. And here I will say, I do think the very important insights already developed through AI-specific ethical reflection need to be embedded into human rights doctrine for the 21st century. And I will say, my view is that I believe people working on AI ethics who are unfamiliar with the human rights framework may be very surprised to learn how much work this framework can do for us. So here, in that regard, I want to identify 4 particular features of the existing human rights framework that make it peculiarly well-suited as a global governance structure for AI. And I'm going to quickly take each of these in turn. The first of which is the human rights framework starts with an assertion of human dignity and the centrality of the human person as the focal point of governance. Human rights inhere in the human person by virtue of humanity. They are universal. These are normative commitments that cannot be taken for granted in an AI future. As everyone in this audience knows well, there are many existential questions swirling around about the future of humanity and the relevance of the human person. Will the human person matter as robots and machines take over so many realms of work? How should we think about human agency and autonomy when so many decisions are made for us by machines? How can we ensure safety and security for humans if autonomous lethal weapons are developed? And how should we think about democratic accountability or human accountability when governance actors do not understand the basis of algorithmic decisions they rely upon? The human rights framework can help us address these questions. And this starting commitment to human dignity and the human person, I believe, is the essential first step in moving toward human-centered governance of AI. The second feature I will highlight of the existing framework is that it established a broad spectrum of substantive and procedural rights that speak directly to the most pressing societal concerns about AI, ranging from concern about the dramatic erosion in privacy associated with digitization of everything. That can be addressed through the right to privacy. Concerns about how algorithmic curation of information impacts human autonomy and agency can be addressed through the lens of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. Concerns about the risk of embedding bias in data that in turn facilitates discrimination under the guise of objectivity can be addressed through reference to the rights to equal protection and non-discrimination. Concern about labor displacement and exacerbation of income inequality is covered by the right to work and by the right to an adequate standard of living. Concerns about the threat of lethal autonomous weapons can be addressed through the lens of the right to life and security in persons. And then concern about loss of human and democratic accountability due to reliance on opaque machine decisions can be referred to through the lens of the right to non-arbitrary processes, and effective remedy. The basic point here is simply that the existing human rights doctrine provides a substantial basis for policy development to address the wide range of societal concerns about AI. Third feature of the framework that I think is useful to global governance is that in addition to normative principles, it defines the roles and responsibilities of both government and the private sector. The original declaration and treaty framework places the primary legal obligation on governments to protect against violations by other state and non-state actors, and to also not violate rights themselves. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights lay out the responsibility of private sector businesses to respect human rights, to engage in due diligence processes to assess the impact of their products and services on human rights, and to remedy human rights harms. And given the increasing impact of private sector businesses on the enjoyment of human rights, especially in digitized societies, I think this was a really important normative development. Last but not least, the human rights framework enjoys a level of global recognition and legitimacy that is extremely valuable. The framework was crafted through global, multilateral, and multi-stakeholder negotiation. It enjoys status under international law and has been embedded in national constitutions and legislation around the world. Its universal applicability has been established. The bottom line is that human rights provide a shared language that's understood globally and enjoys unmatched legitimacy. And I think this combination of features will be almost impossible to replicate. So I want to close by drawing your attention to a few notable resources, initiatives, and leaders in this space who are getting traction. And I do this especially for students in the room who may be interested in becoming part of the AI and human rights movement. Among governments, I will cite the leadership of the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, who is doing cutting-edge human rights-based analysis on government procurement and reliance on AI, as well as on the obligation of governments to protect citizens from harmful impact of AI. I will, in the multi-stakeholder realm, I will cite the partnership between the World Economic Forum and Business and Social Responsibility, BSR. They have a fantastic white paper on responsible tech that brings the specific insights from AI ethics analysis and design principles into the human rights framework so that they can work together. At the international level, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN has started a BTEC initiative, which is intended to articulate more fully how to apply the existing UN guiding principles on business and human rights, specifically to private sector AI applications, products, and services. And then last but not least, I will highlight a couple of private sector initiatives. Element AI, the company is a private sector company represented here today. I see them as leading advocates for multi-stakeholder development of human rights-based approaches to AI governance across all sectors. And I will highlight also Microsoft, combined with Article 1 advisors, is leading the way in developing human rights impact assessment mechanisms specifically for AI. And these initiatives make me feel like we're on the right track. So I'm somewhat optimistic that the global community will increasingly turn to international human rights as a foundation for global governance. Final word, takeaway message I want to leave you with. If we hope to establish the Human Rights Foundation as the basis for global governance of AI, we need to see human rights and AI ethics as synergistic, not as competing approaches. The human rights community and the AI ethics community need to work with and learn from each other. And I will say the many AI-specific ethic insights that have already been developed need to be embedded in human rights doctrine. Last point is we also need much more cross-disciplinary, cross-sector collaboration and education. I think CS people should be getting much more exposure to the existing human rights framework. The human rights community obviously needs much greater exposure to how AI works. Product designers need to work with the human rights community to develop this emerging concept of human rights by design. And I will say that I think this Stanford High event is a great example of what needs to happen, and I am really glad and proud to know that Stanford is leading in this AI governance realm.
Thank you, Professor Donahoe. Now let's welcome Mrs. Jessica Newman.
Okay, hi everyone, and thanks so much to Stanford and High. This has already been an incredible day, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. So I am Jessica Cussins Newman, and I'm a research fellow at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, where I'm excited to lead the new AI security initiative. I'm also an AI policy specialist with the Future of Life Institute and an advisor with the Future Society. So in this panel, we're discussing the governance of AI. So to build off of the framework that Eileen mentioned, I wanted to share some thoughts about the word governance. We use this word to mean a lot more than merely regulation, which we already heard a lot about this morning. We include other political and social phenomena, such as standards and advocacy. We're not only concerned with laws, but also with norms, power, and language. And importantly, this means that we're not only concerned with what happens after technology is built, with regulating something that already exists, but also in everything that contributes to its development in the first place. Questions about what is built, why, and for whom. The picture you see here highlights a facial recognition technology identifying visitors in a display at the Digital China exhibition that happened in Fuzhou in May of this year. We know that AI does not emerge out of a vacuum. Technological developments are shaped by business models, by public discourse, national values, and structural power dynamics. Every aspect of AI development and use, from who is in the room to what tools are built, to what training data is used, to how the systems are tested and how they're monetized, all of these inputs and context are shaped by human decisions and historical realities about power and technology. This is always true for technological developments, but it's particularly noteworthy for AI. And that's because we're creating computer systems that automate human decisions and practices, which means that the values and the biases that we encode into those AI systems are going to be amplified around the world. And if we decide to just wait and see where market incentives lead us, we might find ourselves in a world where few of us want to live. So all of that makes governing AI hard, but it also means that there are numerous opportunities and avenues through which to create change. It's not only the technologists and the lawmakers who have decision-making power. It's also the journalists, the tech workers, the advocates, academics. All of these people can also change the discourse and practices around AI. So I think this is really important. We're facing a general-purpose technology that is automating processes of communication and decision-making that scale to millions of people. Its influence over our lives is already substantial, and it will be significantly more so. So everyone should have a say over what happens next. Here are just a handful of recent headlines that give a sense of what we're up against. AI systems have inherent flaws, including bias and a lack of robustness. They are being used for purposes of cybercrime. And AI competition may be aggravating geopolitical tensions, which could seriously threaten global security. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to try to shine a light on what we're doing so far to govern this technological revolution. My question is, how are we shaping the future trajectories of AI, and are we doing enough? I'll share a brief analysis of how the AI governance landscape is unfolding, using a comparative lens to highlight gaps and opportunities for action. Of course, numerous companies, organizations, and governments have made strides over the past few years. We now have countless strategies and principles, which you've heard about today, to guide AI. But how do we make sense of them and relate them to the important issues that we face? So this is a framework that we developed at Berkeley to help assess and compare what these strategies are really doing and where they are focusing their attention. The framework is called the AI Security Map, and it includes 20 policy priorities for the development of AI across 4 different security domains. These include digital and physical, political, economic, and social. Each topic describes a priority intended to help mitigate an issue that could cause significant harm to people or cause systems-level destabilization. So these are some of the most pressing issues in the global security landscape of AI, which are top contenders for our governance efforts. So for example, within the digital and physical domain, the map includes the priority of having AI systems that are robust against attack, and the responsible use of AI in the military. The political domain includes issues such as mitigating technological labor displacement and reducing AI-induced inequalities. And the social domain includes issues such as privacy and data rights. I won't delve into these issues now, which many of you are familiar with, but I'll highlight how the AI Security Map can be used to provide a visual representation of high-level synergies and divergences among key actors in the AI ecosystem. There are, of course, limitations to this framework. Please keep in mind that the maps only show a snapshot of priorities as indicated in a single document or initiative, and should not be interpreted as fully representing the priorities of an entire institution or government. But to take a first example, let's consider Google's AI principles. These were published in June of last year, and they got a lot of attention. When you review the topics that are covered, this is the map that you get. The principles prioritize the creation of safe, reliable, and robust AI systems that are appropriately transparent, fair, non-harmful, and in line with international law and human rights. They seem quite comprehensive. But then again, if you care about the holistic role of AI in society, you'll notice that the map does have some gaps. Google's AI principles do not talk about issues related to the political security domain, such as the spread of disinformation or the opportunity to support government services or checks against surveillance. Moreover, the principles don't talk about issues related to the economic security domain, including job displacement, improving educational resources, preventing growing inequality, or supporting market competition. As you can see, Google's priorities for AI, as represented in these principles, fall solely within the digital and physical and the social domains. And these gaps aren't that surprising for a tech company, but they do highlight a reality that industry leaders are probably unlikely to address the full set of global security challenges posed by AI systems. Of course, that's not news to many, including those within Google. So a white paper that the company published earlier this year pointed out some contentious uses of AI could have such a transformational effect on society that relying on companies alone to set standards would be inappropriate, not because companies can't be trusted to be impartial and responsible, but because to delegate such decisions to companies would be undemocratic. The gaps that we saw in the map from Google suggest that governments and civil society also have a key role to play in the responsible governance of AI. So let's see how they do. On the government side, there has been a surge in attention to AI over the past few years. This graph, which is from the AI Index annual report, shows the number of times that AI or ML were mentioned in the US Congress. As you can see, attention was relatively stagnant until 2017, and then spiked dramatically in 2018. And a similar trend can be seen in the number of mentions of AI and ML within the UK Parliament. In fact, as you've heard, more than 24 countries have now released national AI strategies. So China was one of the first countries to do so. In 2017, the State Council released the New Generation AI Development Plan, and this map gives an indication of the areas of focus included in that report. As you can see, it was fairly comprehensive, and it covered everything from reliability and international collaboration to educational needs, transparency, ethics, and sustainability. However, the strategy also exhibited some gaps. It didn't address issues of AI robustness, inequality, disinformation, or surveillance. But it turns out that these and other gaps are common among the world's governments. Here is the map for the United Kingdom. Based on the government's AI sector deal, which was published in April in 2018. As you can see, significantly less is covered. The document focuses on AI R&D, training and education, to some extent on transparency and privacy, but it doesn't delve into AI implications, and has no focus on issues relating to safety or reliability. There's actually quite a similar picture for Canada, looking at their Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy, which launched in March 2017. If you look at the map for Singapore, which is based upon AI Singapore, launched in May 2017, you'll notice an even more targeted focus, with just a handful of these issues mentioned. Interestingly, if you compare that to the Artificial Intelligence Technology Strategy, also from March of 2017 from Japan, you'll see quite different priorities. In this case, the majority of attention is in the digital and physical domain, and much less attention is on the societal implications. In fact, no two countries exhibited the same set of priorities across the board. So this slide shows a heat map based upon the priorities indicated in national AI strategies and policies from 10 countries around the world. These included Canada, China, France, India, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The lightest boxes show topics that were only mentioned by 1 or 2 out of those 10 countries. So as you can see, issues around disinformation, surveillance, inequalities, and sadly, human rights are relatively neglected across the board. The need to protect against the malicious uses of AI was also underrepresented in these documents. However, there was widespread agreement about the need to promote AI R&D, update training and educational resources, and improve government expertise in AI, perhaps not unsurprisingly. So out of all of the AI principles and policies that we reviewed using this framework, there's actually only one initiative that managed to produce an entirely full map. And that is the European Commission's high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, which is comprised of 52 representatives from academia, civil society, and industry. And if you look at both of the group's published documents, so their ethics guidelines on AI, as well as their policy and investment recommendations, you'll see that they do address every single one of the topics that's shown here. And that points to one of our takeaways from this analysis, which is that enabling multi-stakeholder initiatives, however painful that can be at times, really does help to reduce blind spots. So that's the first takeaway here. If your goal is to have a more comprehensive policy, increasing multidisciplinarity and diversity is critical. Taking advantage of multidisciplinary as well as community expertise goes a long way to support responsible AI development that address more comprehensive implications of AI. The second takeaway is that industry self-governance is unlikely to fully protect the public interest when it comes to powerful general-purpose technologies. So it is encouraging to see that there is significant effort being made from those in government as well as from civil society. The third takeaway is that despite the differences you saw between nations' approaches, there are also numerous synergies. So there are many opportunities for governments and organizations to coordinate internationally. This is likely to be increasingly important as many of the challenges and opportunities from AI do extend well beyond national borders. And admittedly, this recommendation can be hard for national governments to do on their own. They, of course, also have to consider issues of national competitiveness, but left unchecked, that could incentivize a dangerous race to the bottom, which would not serve anyone's interests. So the role of intergovernmental initiatives is likely to be really valuable here to support in this recommendation. For example, the OECD AI recommendation and the International AI Policy Observatory that they are now developing, are really encouraging examples of this. So 42 countries, including the US as well as some non-OECD members, have signed on to the OECD AI principles already. So this is the first intergovernmental AI standard that we have. This was later supported by the G20, which does also include China. So I see international coordination on AI as not only critical, but also possible. And finally, the last takeaway is a reminder. AI will impact everyone, so everyone should have a say. It's really important at these relatively early stages of AI governance that we make the effort to hear from people who may otherwise struggle to have a voice. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Newman. Now let's welcome Mr. Shihan for his presentation.
Okay, so with the first two panelists, we can see that the topic of our panel today of global AI governance is quite broad. It's important to think about the actors involved, but it's also important to think of the institutions. And in particular, I would like to draw our attention to questions of institutional design in thinking about AI global governance. So the past few years have seen a flurry of policy making on AI at the global level. This flurry is fragmented, that with governance spread across multiple institutions that have disparate participation among nation states and disparate procedures. Jess drew our attention to the OECD principles, which are very important to highlight here in their passage in May and subsequent adoption by the G20. Which is important to highlight because that represented an example or an important instance of China, Russia, and India among the other members of the G20 explicitly endorsing principles that have, quote, AI actors should respect the rule of law, human rights, and democratic values. And this is an important starting point. In 2018, France and Canada proposed the International Panel on Artificial Intelligence, which was inspired by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and would have produced expert analysis to enable international collaboration and coordination in the development of policy, as well as identifying policy gaps in need of prioritization. This was vetoed by the United States in August at the G7 meeting. However, subsequent negotiations are ongoing for the launch of GPI, which would perform similar functions within the OECD. The UN has numerous initiatives related to AI, and I can only highlight a few for you. The high-level panel on digital cooperation earlier this year offered advice to the Secretary General, call for an open forum on institutional reform at the UN to better handle challenges, including AI. The Chief Executives Board for Coordination has approved a plan for AI capacity development within the United Nations and among countries in the Global South. And as Eileen noted, since 2017, the International Telecommunications Union within the UN has hosted a recurring event on AI for global good. It's also important to highlight that since 2014, even earlier, the parties to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons have been discussing lethal autonomous weapon systems. So these initiatives that you see here are not exhaustive, but they give us a sense of the active state of play today. And it's important that, as I have said, that this is fragmented across institutions. At this point, it's unclear if this institutional proliferation is a good thing or a bad thing, but one thing is clear, we're actively in a period of institutional development today. And this development responds to numerous opportunities and challenges, many of which have been raised today. So I can go through this fairly briefly. But there is an important push on thinking through AI development and diffusion through the global economy. McKinsey, for instance, estimates that by 2030, global output will be 14% higher due exclusively to AI. And to put that in perspective, that's the size of the entire US economy earlier this decade. Beyond contributing to growth, the benefits to tackle the UN Sustainable Development Goals on healthcare, poverty, education, sustainable development in regards to climate change are tremendous opportunities. But there are a number of challenges worth highlighting. Some of those fall within the umbrella of political economy. 7 of the 10 largest publicly traded companies today are leading tech firms, and they're all leading the way in AI research and development, but they're only headquartered in the United States and China. Benefits are not evenly distributed, and absent intervention, this will continue. In the medium term, labor automation will pose significant challenges. Furthermore, there's concern that AI could enable robust digital totalitarianism, and we're already seeing visions of this possible future in the People's Republic of China, the use of facial recognition and tracking applications to systematically repress the weaker minority. Military uses of AI, including but not exclusively lethal autonomous weapons, also pose significant risks. They can threaten to destabilize geopolitics and could result in inadvertent or an unmanageable war. And it's important to also highlight that the implications for artificial general intelligence, both in the pro and the con, are so large that it warrants proactive thought. Even if we assign an arbitrarily low probability of achieving such technology in our lifetime, say of 2%, it makes sense from a risk mitigation standpoint to be proactive, to think about global governance. An expert opinion puts this probability much higher, at a 50% chance of AI systems achieving human-level performance on all relevant employment tasks within 45 years. All of these risks and opportunities, and many that I haven't discussed, are reflected in the ongoing flurry of international policymaking today. But this is important to note that this development is underway, but the research in the space on global governance has not kept pace. It's small, there's a small literature and it's growing, but it's too early to speak of a consensus on governance institutions or even questions of institutional design. There are several pieces that I'd like to raise for the audience here today. Alan Defoe, the director for the Center for the Governance of Artificial Intelligence, has produced a wide-ranging research agenda on AI governance that is certainly worth reading. Stephen Cave and Sean O'Hagerty published earlier this year in Nature Machine Intelligence an important piece that raised the significance of path dependencies in the development of the technology and bridging short-term and longer-term concerns in AI. And so this is important to emphasize, that nearly all decisions being taken today, whether they are questions of corporate development, civil society engagement, or government regulation, they all have the possibility to set precedents that will shape the development of the technology going forward. And it's important that we have our eyes open to these possible path dependencies. Martina Kunz and Sean O'Hagerty also offer an existing overview of international law that applies to AI, which is an important step to consider before offering further work. And although the field is fairly new, this hasn't stopped numerous design proposals in addition to the ongoing work that I hired earlier from being suggested. Now, it's good that this literature is growing because one can say that informed design matters, but it's important to note that policymakers are rushing ahead of this literature, and we want to see them consult the ongoing academic research in this space. Now, a key parameter that is implicit on both the ongoing efforts and previous literature is that of centralization. Now, when I say centralization, I mean the idea that governance of a particular issue would lie within the authority of a single umbrella organization. And we can think of this as a spectrum between ideal types. So closer to a centralized regime for trade, you'd see an example of the World Trade Organization. And closer to a fully decentralized regime, you would see the proliferation of multilateral environmental treaties to tackle particular issues. Now, on the environment side, there have been questions of the effectiveness of this approach, and a number of academics have pushed for a World Environment Organization to consolidate these agreements. More broadly, we see a variety of centralized governance regimes ranging from issues that may be quite contentious, like nuclear, to the mundane, dealing with coffee. And so this begs the question of AI. To catalyze thinking on this question, I've written a paper together with Matthias Maas and Luke Kemp, two researchers in political economy and international law. Now, we consider the history of other global governance regimes ranging from environment to trade to the internet. And from this history and an established literature, we draw out a series of considerations on a trade-off between a more centralized or decentralized regime. And I won't have time to go into all the details of these trade-offs. However, I'd like to flag that we'll have a paper draft forthcoming to dive deeper into this. So I would like to highlight a couple of these. For one, centralization can support political power of international governance. And this power can be of a relative sort, in the sense that it can be relatively powerful over previous regimes in the way that the World Trade Organization achieved dominance on trade initiatives within previous environmental treaties. It could also be a functional power in the way that the OECD has steered the course to retain its authority over international taxation governance, despite efforts from other organizations. In the context of AI, such power could be quite useful in order to ensure that new technical developments and foresight analysis can ensure the timeliness of international negotiations on new policy problems as they arise. However, on the other side, centralization can increase institutional brittleness. And this is perhaps not surprising, insofar as an institution is unable to adapt to changing circumstances, whether that be fundamentally due to the technology or due to politics. We may see coordination or governance fail. And this probability is higher when you're speaking of fewer institutions, as you would expect. For example, the International Labor Organization has struggled to adapt to changing norms, global governance, with its structure of participation that does not include civil society. Centrality will similarly, in the context of brittleness, raise the concern of regulatory capture, whether that be AI corporations or another stakeholder group taking undue influence within governance if there's only one institution. I'll highlight just one more again for time, but happy to jump into these later. Centralization is also, on the pro side, useful for improving efficiency and inclusivity. So with the proliferation historically of multilateral environmental treaties, it's been quite difficult for countries in the global south to staff negotiations around the world. They've actually, in cases, had to send ambassadors without technical expertise to technical negotiations. Similar difficulties can be seen with civil society being unable to fund participation in multiple fora at the same time, for instance. Now, today, given the expense of machine learning expertise, you can imagine having a central repository of this expertise within the UN may constitute an economy of scale. And we also today see the difficulties of a diffuse governance network in the sense that we have a 2-day Stanford conference on AI policy, while simultaneously in Paris, the French government is hosting a forum, and people are forced to choose between the two. It's a good example of this difficulty. Now, a conclusion for sort of the central takeaway of our sort of analysis is the centralization offers real benefits, but also real dangers to global governance. And although previously global governance has tended to respond retroactively after harm has been witnessed, it's very encouraging to see that there's a lot of proliferation institutionally today. We hope that our work can catalyze discussion on the questions of design and particularly centrality. So today we have this sort of fragmented status quo, and we want to hold off judgment to say whether or not this is truly a good or a bad thing. However, there's an important element to actually follow the emergence and development of this regime, and that's an element that we go into in the paper as well, proposing a few ideas here that we flagged for monitoring the emerging regime. In particular, to look for conflict between institutions, coordination between them, and the ability to which they are able to catalyze and fill governance gaps internationally. This could present interesting research for academics or also for the OECD Policy Observatory. And there are a number of different methods one could think through. One interesting approach may be to use natural language processing, fact-checking techniques to look for contradictions between policy outputs from particular institutions, looking at meeting minutes or looking at the principles themselves. We hope that future academics' research will consider the importance of centrality, but we also understand that many other stakeholders can benefit from this consideration. In particular, it can help and answer questions like, does the US indeed wish to pursue centralized governance within the OECD as an explicit policy? Does the engagement of Element AI and DeepMind, among others, at many fora represent a policy of pro-decentralization. And should advocacy groups like the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots weigh the pros and cons of pursuing engagement strategies to ban lethal autonomous weapons at multiple fora? We hope that our considerations can inform stakeholders' answers to questions like these. And so I wanted to end on a meme, and I thought I would spare us from the Terminator imagery and offer us a brief overview, which is important. Broadly considering AI global governance, we need to think through the particular institutions at play, and a key question that has been underexplored to this point is how we go about designing them most effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Xian. Now, last but not least, let's welcome Mr. Phil Beaudoin for his presentation.
Good. So we've heard mentioned in the previous talks a number of frameworks. One of them came up twice already in the first two presentations here, and it's the framework for trustworthy AI that was proposed by the European high-level expert group earlier this year. So what I propose to do here today is a slightly deeper dive into that framework that covers a lot of things, and that actually is built on human rights. So building upon human rights and specializing them for the purpose of AI. But before I get started, I wanted to give you just a bit of context about Element AI and why we care about questions like that so much. So about Element AI, we're a product company. We build AI products. And since our inception 3 years ago, we've been closely connected to academia. We've been investing in research at all maturity levels, which means that internally at Element AI, we do fundamental research and publish papers, we do applied research, and we go all the way to what we call machine learning engineering and turning this research into products or components that are useful in companies around the world. And we do that for a wide variety of industries. We don't only do it for the classical like the classical big tech companies. We do it also in the financial sector, in manufacturing, in retail, in logistics, and others. So this is a big challenge. This is a broad challenge, wide and deep, and we don't believe we can do that if we're not doing it within a thriving and collaborative ecosystem. And that's why since the beginning, we've been actively nurturing this ecosystem in our home in Canada, where we're based. And every year since we started, we put out a report, which we call the AI Ecosystem Report in Canada, that highlights the different stakeholders. And we're looking at academic labs, at startup companies, large corporations. We're looking at private investors, as well as the governments and actors from civil society that are playing in the Canadian AI ecosystem. So this is a very complex map you can see here. But if you're interested about learning more of the Canadian ecosystem that we're building Element AI on, I invite you to check out the white paper we published very recently on this ecosystem. So in addition to this thriving ecosystem that we believe we need in order to be successful, we also think that an important competitive advantage we can benefit from as a transversal AI company is a strong legal and ethical framework that would encourage the development of human-centric AI. We think that without that, there's a big risk that we will lose the trust of the people we're building these products for, right? So we need trustworthy AI, and we are investing as a company in helping it come forward through a lot of these multi-stakeholder engagement. And one of the initiatives we've engaged in is this European Commission high-level expert group on AI. In fact, our CEO, J.F. Gagné, is the only non-European person to sit on that expert group. And as was mentioned before, the expert group is very diverse. It includes 52 experts from academia, civil society, research and corporations like ours. The goal of this group, the very clearly acknowledged goal of this group, is to make trustworthy AI their foundational ambition. They care about building trustworthy systems. And the way they want to do that is by relying on a holistic and systemic approach. And the development of deployment of AI system is recognized as concerning not only the technological aspect, but a very complex socio-technological system that needs to be in place in order for this trustworthy AI to exist. If you look at most products we use today, not only the AI products we use, but all the products that we use in our everyday, they typically come with guarantees and responsibilities of use from the product makers. It means that but these things are not necessarily easy to incorporate into AI-based products for a number of reasons. Actually, AI products differ in many ways. Let me give you a couple here. So first of all, AI-based products' performance is highly dynamic, whereas traditional products tend to be based on very strict rules that can be followed in a principled way. AI-based products are based on training data, and they change their effectiveness changes based on the situation. So very highly dynamic performances. Another difference is the way in which accountability occurs in AI-based product. It's much more complex because the system behavior is not always, again, clearly attributable. You've got these systems that have been trained on data. It's unclear who's responsible for which parts of it. So when you want to clearly define the expectations between the stakeholders, this becomes difficult. You can think of what are the responsibilities or the accountability within an AI product of the user, of the vendor, the designer, the engineer, the researcher that played a role in that product. This is much harder to define than for a traditional product that has been based on very strict rules. If you look at all of these issues, these challenges, yeah, I only have 3 slides, so I'm going to talk a lot over each one of them. Yeah, if you look at the danger of these systems is that because they're different, because they're new, because accountability is hard, and because their performance is highly dynamic, there's a real danger that this will cause a lack of trust from the public, from society, in these new technologies. And that's why the high-level expert group has been working on ground rules that could help commonly acceptable standard that could reduce the high transaction cost that risk existing right now if we have to go into that trust transaction for every new AI product that comes forward. And so in that regard, the guidelines are taking an important step to move us from trustworthy AI in the conceptual realm to trustworthy AI at the practical level. So the guidelines are anchored in human rights. And the first thing that the framework proposes are 4 principles that are derived from these rights and that are particularly relevant in the context of AI technology. The first one is the respect for human autonomy. This principle says that we should not coerce, deceive, manipulate, condition, or hurt humans in any way using these AI products. As you can understand, this is pretty relevant today given some of the issues we've seen with existing products that are based on AI and that we use every day. So in a sense, what this respect for human autonomy is about, it's about leaving meaningful opportunity for human choice every step of the way in these products. The second one is prevention of harm, which should exist with any products we develop naturally. But with AI products, it's not only about physical harm, but it's also about human dignity and human mental integrity. These products are being so important and playing with our behaviors or being aware of our behaviors to such an extent that there is a real risk they might impact human dignity and mental integrity. Fairness is another important one, where the high-level expert group recognizes that fairness can have many interpretations. and they go through a couple of them. But interestingly, they distinguish between substantive fairness and procedural fairness. Substantive fairness is defined as the equal or just distribution of the cost and benefits of these new technologies. Whereas procedural fairness highlights the fact that we should have the ability to contest and seek redress when these products do not behave according to their expectations. Fourth is explicability. Explicability is seen, and it's a complex and challenging question when it comes to modern AI system for technological reason in part. But at least these products should be transparent in the sense that their capabilities and purposes should be made very clear and communicated. We should know what the purpose of the product is as a user. And sometimes it's not obvious with a lot of AI products we use today. The decision these products make as they go should also be explained to those that are directly or indirectly affected by these products. And they should be explained in a way that's understandable by the stakeholder, no matter who that stakeholder is and their level of education or understanding of the technology. Finally, we should take careful consideration the challenge of the black box AI systems that you may have heard of, right? These new deep learning models tend to be black boxish in the sense that the systems itself is so complex that if we try to explain it using simple rules or simple explanations, we will not succeed. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have explainability. It should mean we should seek other explicability measures like traceability or auditability of these systems. So the framework goes one level deeper and proposes 7 stakeholder-oriented requirements. And these requirements can actually be implemented. They can be implemented both through technological advancements or technological requirements or through non-technological means, given processes and organizational structures around them. These requirements, according to the expert group, are the ones that should be government regulated. They should be government regulated in the same way we are used to seeing standards be government regulated. So I'm going to name the 7 that are here, and I'm going to deep dive into 3 of them that I think are particularly interesting in the context of AI. So the 7 are human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity and non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and finally, accountability. These should all play a role together and impact one another, and there should be tensions at times between them that should be resolved. But let's dig a bit deeper into human agency and oversight. So, according to that framework, AI systems should act as an enabler to a democratic, flourishing, and equitable society, which means that they should allow users to make informed decisions regarding the output of these systems by providing tools to comprehend and interact with these systems. The kind of tools that should be provided are those that would allow a user to self-assess or to challenge even the system on the decisions that it makes. It should also allow users to make more informed choice in accordance to their goals. And this is one I want to stress in particular, because it's unclear that our technological environment today is aware of our goals, very much aware of our behaviors, the behavior we adopt when you use them. But our goals as humans are typically very different from the behaviors we will adopt. And therefore, what the group recommends is that AI systems, we should be very aware that they can harness subconscious processes in their users, including an unfair manipulation of the users, deception, herding users, or conditioning them. Let's dive into a second one, privacy and data governance. So privacy is a fundamental right that is particularly affected by AI systems, as you all know. Being aware or building privacy-respectful systems would mean including information that is initially provided by the user and making sure we provide privacy on that information, but not only the information you come forward with, all the information that a user will create as they interact with the system. These two should be taken into account, and the privacy of both of these should be respected. Another aspect of data governance that is particularly important is making sure the quality and the integrity of the data is really high. So this includes being aware of social biases, inaccuracies, or mistakes that could happen in the data, that could exist in the data, as well as potential malicious attack that could exist in the data, the initial data, or that can be introduced as the system is built. Which means that in order to respect privacy and data governance, these systems should put in place the planning, the training, the testing, and the deployment processes that would allow for this privacy to be respected, for privacy and data governance to occur correctly. Third and very important topic is transparency. Transparency in the context of AI means, according to this expert group, that the data sets and the data transformation processes should be traceable. This would include the data labeling, the algorithm used, etc. Traceability is required because this is how we can allow auditability of these systems. So essentially, transparency might not mean that we understand every step of the way these systems being black boxes and complex, but they should be auditable. Explainability, another aspect that might be difficult to implement, but that's important, would allow a human to understand specifically or to trace specifically the decisions that are made about him or them by the system. So this would include the recognition that there might be a trade-off between a system's explainability and its accuracy. It's an important one. It might be possible to build a more explainable system at the cost of accuracy, and we should take that trade-off into account as we design these systems. Finally, an interesting one is that users should have the right to know they're interacting with an AI system. This means that transparency would force such a system to not represent itself as a human. We've seen that in the past in some systems, and this framework actually clearly stipulates this shouldn't happen. The third chapter of the framework proposes a very practical pilot version of a trustworthy AI assessment list. And they invite anybody who's building AI products to use that assessment list as a pilot. This includes very practical questions around the 7 requirements that were highlighted here. And these should be assessed by different stakeholders within a corporation, including the board and the management team, legal departments, products and services departments, etc. And the idea here of this pilot is the expert group is looking for feedback on how well this assessment list works in order to build something that might eventually be used as a practical framework to build trustworthy AI. So to conclude, what I would like to highlight here is the importance of these comprehensive multi-stakeholder consultations. In particular, the next step in that process would be such a multi-stakeholder consultation on the impact of AI on human rights and everything that's necessary for regulators to understand how these guidelines can be complemented by legally binding enforceable protections. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the 4 speakers for their amazing presentation. And starting from right now, we're going to have a panel discussion on some key issues that we identified from their speeches. And we will also be taking audience Q&A as we move into several questions of the panel discussion. Thank you all again. The first question that we would like to ask is, since a lot of you has mentioned right now compared with several years ago, the problem we see in the field of AI governance is not a lack of rules. Rather, it's fragmented, as Peter mentioned, fragmented regulatory ideas. So how do you see the multitude of fragmented AI governance structures? Is it an opportunity or is it more of an obstacle? And should we even try to aim for a more centralized governance structure?
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Great question. I think what we've heard is it's a mixed bag. There are aspects of the proliferation of all these new sets of principles that are very positive, in the sense that around the world we see the best and the brightest, gravitating to this subject, and a lot of creative energy that's very exciting, and that's excellent. But as we've also said, there is a concern about undermining the existing global normative framework that we have, and I am very concerned about that. And I think the proliferation of all the different principles can unintentionally figure into the erosion of confidence in the existing framework, and that makes me nervous. Two other things that I will mention is that you just said that we've had a proliferation of principles. I don't think we've had a correspondingly adequate development of what do those principles look like in practice. So we're still at this conceptual level, and we're not yet breaking it down into what does it look like to actually live up to those principles. I will also say that in the existing global human rights framework, we have this set of principles that are well understood. There's international doctrine about what it looks like in practice, but they don't necessarily require homogeneity in implementation. You do get to factor in context. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as well, so that there isn't a sense that the principles are being developed in one place and you're imposing your vision on us. That there is some flexibility in how you make those principles manifest, but there is also a bottom line, and this is where I think the human rights framework is so valuable in telling you have to be concerned about free expression, privacy, the right to life, the right to security, equal protection, non-discrimination. All of those core principles have to be respected, even while there is cross-cultural diversity in what it looks like in context.
If I can just respond to that point. So I think we're at an early enough stage in this where diversity of ideas is really valuable, and I want to see more of that. Which is not to say that coordination isn't additionally useful and beneficial and needed. And we're seeing good examples of that, such as the high-level expert group and the work at OECD. In terms of the issue of implementation, in terms of how do we actually get from principles to practice, which is where a lot of people are focusing now, I think California is a really interesting example of this. Since we are here today, California did endorse the Asilomar AI principles, so that I think is a beneficial statement of caring about that we see the trustworthy and beneficial development of AI, not just the development at all costs. But then additionally, we have seen a lot of regulation come recently from California. We have the CCPA, our data privacy law, that's going into effect in January. There are 2 laws surrounding deepfakes. So one about prohibiting it in the upcoming months towards an election, and also giving people who are represented in a deepfake in a sexually explicit way the right to actually sue on their behalf. We have a law about facial recognition for law enforcement, and other examples. So I think we are actually a good case study of some early efforts to try to implement some of those principles.
Stone, I'm happy that you asked this question. It sort of gets to the heart of the paper that I'm trying to raise. I think it's too early to say, as Eileen's saying, that we have proliferation of principles, and then this question of, as these principles become sort of realized in practice, is a very important element to follow. Hence, this emphasis on monitoring the regime over time. I can give you an example, I guess, of a point where we might expect quite a bit of conflict in that in the market standards context, IEEE and ISO IEC are two distinct organizations both pursuing market standards for AI. And so this is a very good example, perhaps, of where we would expect a conflict, perhaps. But in practice, the two have established liaison relationship to follow each other's work quite closely. And so this will be an interesting element to follow if that type of relationship will be emulated elsewhere, hence the need to sort of wait and see. Though I think it's important to emphasize that we don't want to wait too long on the principles. OECD sort of contextualized their principles by describing their previous work on privacy, but those sort of came to fruition in 1980, and I don't think any of us would say that they were realized in practice soon enough. And so it's important to note that the principles are there, but monitor and perhaps catalyze the development.
And I don't have much to add, but I want to stress Eileen's point, because I think there is widespread recognition that AI technology is special or different. There's something there that wasn't there before. But is it different to the point where we would need an entirely new set of principles? And I think the answer that the high-level expert group gives is pretty interesting, saying, no, this can be rooted in human rights. We just have to understand how these human rights needs to be specialized or understood in the context of the new challenges AI technology has. So what I think is missing now is some form of more global leadership to try to align some of these initiatives. Lots of really good ideas out there, but I think we've reached a point where we actually need to see some government or non-governmental organizations step forward and try to have some leadership in this cohesion or trying to make all of these work together. And in my opinion, this high-level expert group is actually showing the way in an interesting way, and should probably look at the work that's being done there.
Thank you. I'd like to jump off the point about from conceptual to practical, and also about global leadership that Phil mentioned. So I think we are having a consensus that multilateral cooperation is something that we want to pursue. If that's the case, how might multilateral effort take into account the wide variation across countries in their risk appetite, in what areas they try to focus on, as Jessica mentioned? How might we go about doing that?
Well, I mean, I think recognizing the importance of the diversity is key, and these frameworks should focus on the human rights as an interesting framework that should be recognized widely. But then, on the specifics of the implementation, should have enough freedom for this diversity to be expressed.
Yeah. I think we shouldn't assume that there will be the same principles kind of universally around the world. Particularly when it comes to regulation, there are real trade-offs that have to be made, and not every place will want to make the same prioritization and trade-off in how they want to manage these technologies. I mean, just for an example, if you live somewhere that is more dangerous, your trade-off with public safety versus privacy might look a little bit different. And we shouldn't sort of assume that one prioritization is going to work universally in different contexts. But to the point of supporting more global governance, we really do need to see more centers of gravity. So not just in the Western world, but these kinds of conversations happening in the global South, and more integration between what is already happening there and what we're doing here. So that's kind of the way to, I think, push the needle.
So I would articulate it slightly differently, which is a little bit more what Phil was saying. I do think, as it relates to human beings, we have the principles we need. and we need to be very careful not to erode commitment to those principles. Under the existing human rights framework in a rule of law context, there is always, and there always has been, a balancing of the rights and the tension between the rights, free expression and privacy, democratic participation and free expression, public safety, privacy. There has always been the necessity to sort of optimize for the values you choose. And so I always am careful to say we don't need new principles as it relates to human beings. We do need to allow new modes of optimizing for the various principles in this digitized AI-driven context, and also cross-cultural variability depending on context, both of those things. But it's not so much new principles. Now, I will just clarify even further. Some of the principles that are being developed aren't so much focused on the human person. They're focused on the AI itself. And so I think the safety, robustness, those kinds of things are a different kind of principle that, you're right, may be emphasized in different ways cross-culturally, but I hold on to that idea. We have universal principles as they relate to human beings, and we need to hold on to those.
To that point, it's promising that the G20 has endorsed their own AI principles that draw heavily from the OECD's, with that particular emphasis on human rights. Again, the question is to what extent this will be implemented in practice. And of course, in that implementation, you need to take into account the local context. I think there's an interesting sort of piece in what you raise, Eileen, of emphasizing that there are sort of human-centered principles in its development and deployment, but then there are also important emphases on sort of the technical particularities of technology, and safety as an emphasis is quite shared globally. But I think in this sort of vein, it's important that we come back to this context of diversity and multi-stakeholder involvement, knowing that there is quite a bit of history thinking through human rights principles and governance in particular contexts, but when it touches sort of technical questions, it's important that people at the cutting edge of research themselves are also at that table and having that kind of contextualized conversation to realize both the principles in practice and then further their development. And what we're seeing here today and other stakeholder groups actively is promising on that.
If I may add just a little thing about the challenges of diversity when you think about the global south is, for sure there might be not differences in principles, but maybe in the set point and the tension between these different principles. But something that's very real is the state of technology right now is not uniformly distributed. And one of the challenges that exists, and that is one of the cause of this diversity, is not every country, especially if you look at the global south, is at the same AI enablement level today, right? Access to technology, access to the internet, the size and quality of the data sets that they have to solve their problems might not be the same. So that's actually one challenge we will have to take if we care about fairness of these new technologies.
And relatedly, to some degree, the proliferation of principles I don't see as kind of reinventing the wheel every time. I think there's a lot of organizations looking inward and saying, okay, we're developing these technologies, we know they're having these impacts in the world. What is responsibility in our context for our consumers in our market look like? So I think that them going through that process and putting out a public statement of this is what we care about, that matters, and that every single company could do that, and it wouldn't necessarily be reinventing the wheel or moving away from a human rights framework. It might just be a sort of additional signaling to their constituency that they care about these issues and are taking them seriously.
Totally agree, and I would just say that they could do that, but they could also explicitly do human rights impact assessments in conjunction with committing to their own self-developed principles and applying them to the products and services that they're providing.
we will ask the final question, and then we'll open the questions to our audience. So the final question, I like to tie the two themes together. One is about the industry or private sector's self-assessment. The other one is the global south, or companies that are located in other countries other than Europe and North America, where we have a lot of regulations already. How might government or public sector work with and collaborate with private sector and civil society to get their buy-in and cooperation within global governance, if we're talking about it in a global sense?
I think that's easy in the sense that I think everyone has come to recognize governments can't do it alone, private sector can't do it alone, and that the public has to be brought into this conversation to develop trust. And so I think everybody is clamoring for a multi-stakeholder approach to policy development. And I don't think anybody has to go kicking and screaming anymore. Governments don't adequately understand the technology to do it without the private sector or technologists. Technologists don't adequately understand the governance realm, the human rights responsibilities, et cetera. And generally speaking, I think if we are going to capitalize on this technology, it is incumbent upon us to make sure the public really has a basic understanding of what does it mean to live in an algorithmically driven society and how are we being affected. And I think we really risk much greater social political disruption if the public doesn't understand the basics, because they're going to be dramatically affected in their autonomy and agency, and it's not going to be a pretty picture if the public isn't on board and understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more, Eileen. I think one litmus test that I propose in order to see how efficient these multi-stakeholder initiatives can be is to see which organizations or which groups speak against them or refuse to engage in them or don't engage wholeheartedly in them. I mean, we hear a lot of excuses for these to not work ahead of time, right? These will be too slow, these will stifle innovation, these will cause the wrong kind of outcomes. Well, I do believe that what we're seeing right now in terms of multi-stakeholder initiatives around AI frameworks, AI policy frameworks, AI global governance are actually working pretty well, and they do involve a wide diversity of factors. So I would actually say, again, the litmus test is, are there actors that actually refuse to join these or refuse to actively make them work? Let's just encourage them to take part in this, because I believe the public will be informed, the governments will be informed, the large corporations will actually be able to innovate if we all sit together at the table and we bring our various expertise with a real desire to make this thing work.
I agree. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I do think there's more that governments can do, though, to support industry to be following with the global governance initiatives. So in federal funding and support that's going towards AI development, encouraging that funding is being directed towards work that is actually following international standards, for example. You could incentivize industry to focus on those issues in that way. Also, when governments are procuring AI technologies, actually caring, do these technologies abide by international standards? That's a really obvious way that a lot of governments aren't yet doing. And then finally, just, a lot of governments aren't actively engaging in global governance themselves. So, leading by example would be a good first step as well.
So I'm very happy that this panel sort of started to emphasize multi-stakeholder governance models. And I very much would agree that the future of governance is multi-stakeholder. And I'm happy, Phil, that you sort of gestured towards this idea of monitoring as an important element. And in particular, I guess I would caution some of the history of thinking around multi-stakeholder governance initiatives. the UN Internet Governance Forum comes to mind first and foremost, as a place that tends to sort of compartmentalize conversations and not necessarily lead to policy outputs. And if we were to monitor participation, that itself also would not necessarily give us a full picture, in that we can see attendees come from many of the leading corporations in the world as well, but they don't participate in the sessions with civil society and academia actively. And so we need to be quite careful when we look at ongoing initiatives, this in the context of internet governance, but they're talking about AI as well, but more particular to our topic of AI governance, that we need to be very careful about thinking through what does active and collaborative and constructive participation look like. And I think coming back to an earlier point that was raised, thinking of sort of capacity development or the need for a global South kind of representation, I think it's quite important to understand the dynamic that Joy raised earlier of this possible sort of data or digital colonialism. And we want to sort of help with development and think through the power of AI technologies for this. But insofar as we're saying, oh, we want the technology to spread, we should encourage companies to participate in those fora. We need to make sure that there's a very eyes open, very, very conscious of the power dynamic that is there. And so I guess to wrap that sort of in a neat bow, it's promising and encouraging to see the high-level sort of work coming out of the UN for the Chief Executives Board for coordination, trying to support the capacity development within the UN itself, but also in countries in the Global South. And the ITU is taking the lead on implementing this roadmap. And it'll be encouraging and exciting to follow this work as it happens in the coming years.
Do we have the mic? Yeah. Now we open the panel for our audience question, and feel free to raise your hand. We will have our volunteer to deliver the mic to you. And please do include a self-intro before you ask your question.
Thanks so much for your talk. So I wanted to raise a potential kind of difficulty when we want to think about bridging the human rights framework to these ethical principles. So it seems that sometimes when we talk about human rights, we use some qualitative concepts like dignity that somehow we don't measure, or it's questionable whether we can measure them or not. And on the other hand, when we have ethical principles and we want to implement them, like by their own definitions, they should be measurable, or we have to somehow make them quantifiable, like when we have fairness or explanation or whatever else. So it seems to me that there should be a kind of a difficulty when we want to bridge or make basically all of these ethical principles on this human right framework. And it depends on how we think about like dignity. If dignity is something untouchable and it's impossible to make it quantitative, then how these ethical principles want to fully capture human rights. So I was wondering how do you think about the limits of this, like framing this debate on the human rights framework?
So I'll jump in there. I think that's a really interesting point and question. I think it's fair. And I would start with an understanding of the human rights framework almost as a metaphysical assertion about the reality of human dignity and the inherent value of the human person. And I suspect a lot of technologists think, what the heck is that? But I think that is the, that's what happens when you end up coming out of a crisis like World War II, where there is, the world actually came together to say, we're going to create a global normative compact that says the human person is valuable, and then provided a framework for analyzing the different dimensions of the human personality that needed to be protected. I agree with you. It's hard to develop metrics in some technical sense, but it is not hard to do analysis about whether or not you are or are not protecting privacy, free expression, equal protection, non-discrimination. And with that last one, equal protection, non-discrimination, some of these new ethical principles are really almost directly coming from that concept in the human rights framework. So I think there are different levels of abstraction to the different rights. And I think we need to get comfortable. The way I understand the Stanford Human-Centered AI program is really about making that move to say human beings matter. And one of the three strands, there's a lot of the technological work about mimicking human intelligence is one important strand. The other one about human-machine interaction and augmenting human capacities. But the third bucket is about human impact. And so Stanford is starting with that commitment to say that's what we care about. And I do think the human rights framework is a great global framework that can help bring the conversation here about human-centered to the global arena.
If I may, I'm a nerd myself. I'm a technologist, and when I think about these questions, I find it fascinating because I always wonder, how can I bring my system at a technological level to understand them? But what I like about the way some of these frameworks are approaching the question is they are approaching them from a socio-technological angle. It's no longer a technological system, it's a socio-technological system with a lot of potential feedback loops that are around the technology itself. And for questions like human dignity, I think this makes me a lot more comfortable, knowing that there might be, legal systems that are about opposing competing analysis in order to identify whether or not human dignity was respected in a given situation. I find this is a much more promising approach to reaching an interesting framework or an interesting set of mechanisms than if we stick to the technological angle. So I would say having these frameworks graduate outside of university labs is promising, and this is one strength that I find the recent proposals.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. I'd also just add a question of pushing back, I guess, on sort of prioritizing quantification too much, because there's another area that people tend to think can be dealt with quantifiably in the sense of fairness, looking at the distribution of the data, protected classes, et cetera. But that loses the larger context of the way of, even if you have, say, a system that can recognize the intersectionality of, say, Black women's faces with 100% accuracy, then how will you use the system in practice? And so insofar as you seek to quantify this particular element, you may forget the larger context of the way you're deploying the system after the fact. And so it's important to not throw out the qualitative approaches necessarily. And in the context of other metrics, you can think it's encouraging that the European Commission's advice emphasizes key performance indicators as a potential area for companies to actually implement these things. And so if you can think about trying to, again, move up to a higher level of abstraction to think through ways that you can optimize metrics in a corporate governance context to address the key elements, whether it be human dignity, accountability, or fairness.
Hi there. Thank you for a wonderful panel. My name's Jamie Suskind. I'm the author of a book called Future Politics, and I practice discrimination and human rights law in England. I wanted to just add, if I may, to the discussion about human rights as a framework for this kind of regulation. Because from my practice and my experience, I have some concerns about it as an effective way to regulate the kinds of technologies that we're talking about. Just to take one example, the problem posed by misinformation on Facebook, for instance, is one that erodes the quality of democratic debate in a country as a whole. But it's not immediately clear to me how it resounds in terms of human rights, how any individual who perhaps sees a piece of fake news has suffered a sufficient legal wrong that they can then go to a court and ask for them to have that right vindicated. It seems to me that the problem we're facing there is a communal problem, one that faces everyone through 1,000 small cuts rather than one egregious breach of someone's rights. Another example might be face recognition technology. The English courts recently said it doesn't breach an individual's human rights for the state to take pictures of their face without permission. But if you step back and look at society as a whole, you might say that the overall effect is one which is unacceptable to us. So what I'm concerned about is a system that's based in individuals vindicating their individual rights, putting aside the cost and expense of taking someone to court, be it the state or a big tech company, might not actually adequately protect people in the future. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
So the first thing is, I do think disinformation implicates several human rights for individuals, which is the right to freedom of expression and access to information, the right to privacy that's being compromised through data collection, micro-targeting in disinformation campaigns, as well as the right to democratic participation. And so I do think it provides a basis for analysis. It is very complicated subject to go into what is the basis for regulating disinformation in a democracy. We could spend the whole day talking about that topic. Generally, it's understood that it shouldn't be on a content basis. It's much more on a manipulative behavior basis. But it is because it's eroding those rights. And then I would also say the human rights framework is not solely about individuals. It is about the community and the values of a society being collectively eroded, whether it is the erosion of privacy, the erosion of civic participation, civic discourse, and democratic election processes. So I think there is a valid human rights entry point to the disinformation threat.
To add a little, I think, the framework itself can be the right one, but I do believe it needs to be specialized. Even if it's only to help legislators make sense of these new challenges that are brought forward by AI technology. And the examples you give, the decisions might be rooted in human rights with an imperfect understanding of the impact of these technologies on all of society. That's why the work that's being done in order to say, let's dig deeper into human rights principles and figure out, in the particular case of machine learning trained systems and data sets, what are the implications of these systems on the human rights in order to better inform all the systems in society, all the actors in society as to the deeper impact on human rights. I don't know what you think about that, Eileen. I'm not an expert at all in human rights, but I do believe this plays an important role, this exercise of going a bit deeper.
I agree.
Thank you. My name is Delphine Algan-Mishra, and I work for press freedom organization Reporters Without Borders and Signals Network. And I have two questions that are related to the topics already discussed. First is about Eileen's point. I agree that the existing human rights framework should be used. I also used it for many years to obtain the release of journalists, so I also know, as you know also firsthand, that it has some flaws, and some of them are slow implementation and a lack of accountability when violation occurs. But I still want to believe in that way, and so I would love to hear your views on how you see efficient implementation of this existing human rights framework related to AI. And my second question, because I work for a press freedom organization, so I'm obsessed with press freedom and the fight against disinformation. So of course I was shocked when, Jessica, you showed the AI maps showing that actually the fight against disinformation is at the bottom of priorities of the AI principles. So I want to be optimistic here. So I hope all of you have heard of promising initiative that use AI to counteract and fight disinformation. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think on one hand it speaks to how quickly the field is moving and why potentially having more of a precautionary principle would benefit us, because a lot of those national strategies came out in 2017, and I think people were just grappling with the massive effects of disinformation, and so I think they're sort of playing catch up. I think if you looked at some of the principles or policies that have happened maybe within the last 6 months, maybe you would see a little bit more focus on that area. At least I would hope so. There's certainly no reason for us to be ignorant of its negative impacts anymore.
I will just add that, reinforcing your point, I think with the disinformation threat, everybody, every sector was caught off guard. The national security community, the cybersecurity community, the human rights community, everybody. And basically all agencies of government were caught flat-footed, certainly in the 2016 US election, and globally we've seen this problem. So I think the early attention has just been put on diagnostics and understanding how does it work. And there's we have a new cyber policy center here at FSI, and at least one of our pillars, Alex Stamos and Renee DiResta, are really in the business of doing that diagnostic work so that technologists and governance people can get their heads around, like, how does this even work? And I think disinformation as a threat to democracy globally has really risen much higher in the policy agenda, and I bet you're right. If those frameworks were being crafted today, disinformation would get a lot more attention.
Scott Forstall. I led the creation of iOS and the iPhone. So I'm fascinated by this idea of using the human rights framework as a basis for this. But I guess I want to dig into the next level of that, which would be, would you believe that it can apply to all 20 of the principles that Jessica put up there? I guess this is a question maybe for Jessica and you. And is there a paper that describes a practical way of turning that into the human rights framework into a set of principles that cover all these items?
Great question. So the two things I would point to in what would it look like in practice, and where is it written, or what can you turn to? Go look at information, particularly I would say about Microsoft's human rights impact assessment for AI. They are developing the processes along with an entity called Article 1 Advisors. And this concept of human rights impact assessments has been out there for a while. It flows from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, where there was an assertion of the need to do, responsibility of the private sector to do due diligence processes to make sure they're not harming human rights. And that idea is now being applied to AI-specific product and services. And I would say Microsoft is kind of on the leading edge of that as a private sector entity, because not only have they embraced the human rights framework, but they've chosen to use that framework for their due diligence process. And so they are leading in that space. The other thing I would point to is what I mentioned in one of the slides, which is there, in Australia, there happens to be a human rights commissioner. So not every government has a human rights commissioner, but Australia does. They have a human rights institution, and the person in that role, his name's Ed Santow. He is, I think, doing the cutting edge analysis of what does it look like for a government to do a human rights impact assessment as it relates to procurement of AI products and services from the private sector, reliance on AI products and services in governance decisions that impact citizens' rights, and then also in terms of the proactive obligation of governments to protect citizens' rights. And so he's done a lot. There's substantial writing and reports by the Human Rights Commissioner in Australia that I would suggest you turn to for analysis on government.
I would just add that this is a really hard problem. And if you look at the issue of lethal autonomous weapons as an example, where you would think so obviously that this would be a human rights violation on multiple counts, the UN has not been able to do much on this front. The CCW has held meetings over numerous years, and because it requires a consensus, no action has been able to happen. There's a few states, the US included, that don't think something like an international ban is the way forward. But here's an issue where we're talking about technologies that we've heard today are inherently flawed. They're not reliable, robust, explainable. They have kind of biases baked in. And we're talking about actually implementing them onto the battlefield, making life or death decisions with impacts for an entire nation. So I think this is a really misguided way forward that would not be in the interests of any of the global powers, let alone anyone else. And so, as a kind of what should have been an easy case study for how we implement a human rights ideal into an international global governance framework, we haven't done so well yet.
I just have to jump in there because I think this connects with the question earlier about efficacy of the framework. We have to admit the UN itself is a global institution made up of 194 governments. And in many regards, like a lot of governments we see in and of themselves at the national level, the institution of the UN is not always high functioning. And there is a lot of dysfunction in the institution. I think you can separate that. I mean, there's geopolitics involved, lots of global dynamics. The framework itself isn't the problem. It is human beings and governments and companies living up to what the framework requires. So, everybody can get involved and make it more efficacious if able, yeah.
And just to add the third practical source, the framework I presented, chapter 3 of that, is actually a trustworthy AI assessment checklist. So you can go through that. It's a very practical checklist. It's still at a pretty high level, given that the technology is not there yet to be super specific about the technological requirements, for example, but it's still a very practical checklist to go through if you're interested in assessing whether or not you're on the path towards trustworthy AI.
Due to time constraint, we'll be able to take one final question from the audience. Yeah, they're in the back. Yeah, they're in the back.
Thank you. My name is Emma Day. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I've been working for UNICEF for the past few years, based in Southeast Asia. And one of the reasons I came to the US was because children in most parts of the world are using American apps, and those countries don't have jurisdiction over the data. There's not a lot they can do to protect children using those apps. And I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm trying to use this framework, but what troubles me learning about the US legal system is that it's not rights-based. And I'm wondering, given the domination of these American companies, how can we hold them to this human rights framework? What's the process in America? Because not just from a legal point of view, but even from a commercial business point of view, companies in other countries look to the US big companies for leadership. So we have to find a way to set an example both in law and in practice.
So that's a complicated question. Let's see. I will start by saying, in terms of holding the private sector companies accountable, this is why their own self-embrace of a human rights frame is valuable. And if they self-commit to these principles and the human rights impact assessments, you have an avenue by appealing directly to the companies. On the US legal system, I would not agree that it's not rights-based. I will agree, it's constitutional rights, many of which overlap tremendously with the human rights framework, and there's a lot of
coherence between those two frameworks in terms of the actual values. I think what you're pointing to, though, is not a lack of values. It's sort of the jurisdiction problem in the legal system. And here's the strange irony, is that the post-World War II liberal democratic order and the post-Westphalian world is really built on the concept of nation states defined by territorial boundaries. That jurisdictional concept doesn't really work in a globalized, digitized information ecosystem. And I think that's the real problem you're pointing to, that we still have national legal systems, geography-based, and the ideas that governments are there to protect their own citizens or people within their own territory and jurisdiction, and we need new jurisdictional principles that help us protect rights across borders. And there is some interesting work happening in that realm, but I think it's one of the most complex areas.
I guess I would just add that there's the question of what we ideally want to see, and also like what we can do with what we have right now. And to a large extent, these companies are engaging and exploring with self-governance mechanisms, and there are examples of that working more well and less well. Famously, Google's external AI ethics committee did not last very long. But I think Microsoft is a good example here. They have the example that you mentioned. They have also instituted ethics into their regular product checklist, from what I understand. They also have what they call the Ether Committee with top-level executives to assess the implications and safety and reliability of all of their AI products and who they're selling those products to as well. And part of that is a hotline that any employee can call if they're concerned about any kind of instance of abuse or kind of example of something that might be unsafe. So that's small potatoes in the large scheme of things, but is maybe one example of what a company can do at this point with the limited kind of frameworks that we have in terms of what's instituted.
And that marks the end of today's breakout session. I would like to invite everyone to join me in a warm round of applause to all the speakers and their amazing viewpoints. And I would like to invite each speaker to stay around for a little bit longer, so our audience, if you have other questions, can come up to the stage and feel free to interact with them. Thank you, everyone.